In this course, we are going to go over two frameworks for cross-cultural communication. One of them is Erin Meyer's culture map, and the other one is Hofstede's cultural dimensions. The reason why I chose Erin Meyer's dimensions is because they're highly practical and very easy to understand and apply. However, there's one problem. She describes a very small subset of countries. And it makes sense because most likely these are the countries you'll be dealing with, because these are the main centers of international business operations. Countries like Japan, Germany, perhaps Russia. However, my goal for this course is to give you a broader perspective than just a small subset of countries. And I also wanted to give you a tool that you can use in the future, regardless of which country you happen to work with or travel to. So I included Geert Hofstede's dimensions. His research was done in 93 countries. That's a lot more. And he has this absolutely awesome website that you can use to conduct your own research. You can play here and compare countries to get an idea in what ways they might be different from yours and what kind of culture you can find there. It's super fun, and you're going to need this for your final project, and I'll link it for you. Besides, Hofstede's work is kind of a gold standard, the main framework you'll see in most work or research related to cross-cultural communication, psychology, or sociology. Erin Meyer actually also used his research in her work. So what are Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and how did he come up with them? It all started in 1970s, 1960s, thanks to IBM. You probably all know this American corporation. The company at that time had operations in about 50 countries, and they were really struggling with managing all people in all these countries because clearly there were differences in how teams interacted and how they understood company goals, company values, and instructions. So IBM hired Hofstede, and he's a Dutch researcher who was studying psychology in the Netherlands at that time. He was hired as a manager of personnel research. In order to understand people's behaviors and how they collaborated at IBM, he developed a questionnaire and traveled to all the IBM locations to conduct surveys and interviews with IBM employees. He collected data from 100,000 respondents. This kind of a sample size is still huge today, and it's actually one of the largest cross-cultural, cross-national databases that we have today. So what kind of questions did he ask those employees, and how did he actually come up with the dimensions? He had a pretty long questionnaire, but there are some questions to give you an idea. For example, how often in your experience are subordinates afraid to contradict their boss, or students their teacher? And there was a 5-point Likert scale from never to always. Never, seldom, sometimes, usually, always. Another question was, how important it is to you to have a boss or direct superior that you can respect? And again, a 5-point scale with from 5 being of utmost importance and 1 being of very little or no importance. And the last question that I want to give you as an example is how important it is to you to keep time free for fun. And again, a 5-point Likert scale from 1 being of utmost importance and 5 being of very little or no importance. So he had many questions like that, and when he began to analyze them, he noticed 2 really interesting things. First, he realized that some questions were related to one another. For example, out of the 3 questions that I gave you, people who said that they often experience or see that employees are afraid, or subordinates are afraid of their boss, they would also be more likely to say that it is important for them to have a boss that they can respect. In other words, the higher they rated one question, the more likely they were to rate higher the related question. When that happens, researchers that do statistical analysis say that these questions load together, which means that they measure the same underlying concept. In this case, specifically, Hofstede called this dimension power distance, and we'll be discussing it later. So he ended up discovering 6 groups of questions that were loading together, were interrelated. And hence, we now have 6 dimensions, six underlying concepts, which later became the dimensions as we know them today. Second, he realized that average scores for these groups of questions that load together varied significantly from one country to another. For example, let's say people in the United States rated question 1, how often that is that they see that employees or subordinates are afraid of their boss, at somewhere 2.5. That is, people are afraid of their boss somewhere between rarely and sometimes. And then the related question, how important it is to have a boss that you can respect, at somewhere 3. Let's say it's going to be 3, on average of moderate importance. When we combine these 2 questions into one scale, and we can do it, as we know, because they load together, they measure the same concept, we sum up 2.5 and 3, which gives us an average score of 5.5 for that concept in the United States. Now let's say people in Malaysia, on average, scored 4.5 on the first question. People are afraid to contradict their boss. That is somewhere between usually and always. And the average score for the second question about the boss that they can respect was around 4. That gives us a total score of 8.5 for Malaysia. So the scale would look something like this. So give me my drawing. So minimum combined score for the 2 questions would be 2, because as you remember, the scale is measuring from 1 to 5. So if someone would give the smallest score to each of the questions, we would have a minimum score of 2. And the max score would be 10, because 5 plus 5, each question had a maximum score of 5. And I'm obviously oversimplifying the math here. There were a lot more questions, but in essence, that's how the scale worked. So he repeated these measurements for all countries, and that's what we use now as country scores on Hofstede's dimensions. So what are the 6 dimensions that he discovered? The first dimension was individualism versus collectivism. This dimension, or this discussion of whose interests are more important, those of an individual person or those of the group, has existed in society long before Hofstede had done his research. So his research mainly confirmed that people in the world still have a different understanding of whose interests should be superior, those of the group or those of an individual. A lot has been written and said about individualism and collectivism, and that's probably one of the most fundamental things that distinguishes cultures. Let's watch this short video by Nova Academy. It does a really good job explaining the differences between individualist and collectivist cultures.
From the moment we're born, we begin to develop our identities. Who are we? What should we care about? And how should we relate to all these people around us? As it turns out, the way each of us answers these questions largely depends on the culture we grow up in. One major difference between cultures in the East and the West is how they view the individual in relation to the group. Some cultures tend to place more importance on the individual. They're known as individualistic or me societies. Many Western societies, including those in the United States, Australia, and large swaths of Europe, are considered me cultures. People in a me culture believe each individual is responsible for their own well-being. Their circle of responsibility extends only to their immediate family members, parents, spouses, or children. They view their responsibility to others in society, like their neighbors or classmates, as limited. After all, they're also individuals who should be taking care of themselves. On the other hand, some cultures place more importance on the group. They're called collectivist societies, or we cultures. Many Eastern cultures, including those in China, India, and Japan, are considered we cultures. People in a we culture prioritize strong social ties and belonging to a larger group. These groups might include classmates, neighbors, and extended families. They strive for group harmony and believe the individual should make the best decisions for the overall well-being of their group. If you take care of the group, they'll take care of you. So how does this me versus we difference shape our behavior? As it turns out, this seemingly subtle distinction has some surprising effects. Imagine two families each go out to dinner. The family from a me culture might consist of just 4 people, 2 parents and their 2 children. The family from a we culture would need a much larger table to make room for 2 children, their cousins, and multiple sets of parents and grandparents. At the me table, everyone would order the specific meal they wanted. When the food comes, they may trade a bite or 2, but for the most part, each person would eat their own meal. At the we table, on the other hand, multiple dishes would be ordered for the whole table. They would be placed in the center, and all members of the family would share them. Now, let's say a family member was running late. How is each table likely to respond? At the me table, people are expected to be masters of their own fate. So when teenage brother Lee arrives late, the family is more likely to attribute his tardiness to some fundamental aspect of Lee's personality, like assuming he is lazy or irresponsible. At the we table, on the other hand, they're more likely to see Lee's behavior as part of a larger context. Rather than blaming him for being lazy, they may assume external factors were involved. Maybe there was an accident on the road, and Lee got caught in bad traffic. This tendency to either credit the individual or the larger context applies to positive things too. Say Lee was coming from a basketball game where he scored a game-winning shot. At the me table, Lee would be celebrated as the hero. His individual action won the game for the whole team. In a celebratory toast, Lee would likely speak about how his hard work, determination, and focus led him to this moment. Meanwhile, at the we table, the team's overall victory would be celebrated. Lee's toast would more likely focus on how his teammates, coaches, and mentors led to the team's success. He may even mention a larger context, like the support of the team's school administration or fan base. Both of these viewpoints are true. Lee's actions secured the victory, but the team's effort won the game. There is no objective, right or wrong way to think about individuals versus groups. What works for one culture just may not work for another.
So, to summarize, this dimension describes if a culture prioritizes individual freedom or group harmony, if people put themselves first, or if they put others, their social group, first. Here's a side-by-side comparison of these two opposite values. So in individualist culture, we see that the interest, as I've said, of the individual prevails over the interests of the group. In collectivists, that's the other way around. Ties between individuals in individualist societies are very loose. You're kind of your own person, and you don't really depend on your social group, nor you're seeing others, the out groups, as a threat. In collectivist cultures, people are integrated into a very cohesive, strong, closely knit groups that protect them in exchange for loyalty. At the same time, others, the out groups, people who don't belong to their social circle, to their social group, are often seen as a threat. In individualist cultures, people look after themselves and their immediate family, meaning their mother, their father, brothers and sisters, children. That's it. In collectivist cultures, they include, their family is extended. So we have their aunties, cousins, all the members of their extended family. In individualist cultures, what a person does defines that person. In collectivist cultures, who a person is connected with defines that person. One interesting thing that I've read about is actually in individualist societies, a lot of common last names, most common last names come after or come from professions such as butler, smith, archer, and things like that. In collectivist cultures, last names more often come from the name of ancestors, and they can be loosely translated as the son of or from the house of. And of course, last name like this also exists, let's say in America, I don't know, Peterson, son of Peter, right? But they're more common in collectivist cultures. Also, individualist societies are typically characterized by low context communication, whereas collectivist societies are more high context. And that is because of the differences in how much shared background people have. We know that if people don't know each other that well, they have to use direct or low context communication style to make sure that everybody understands each other. If you are in the same group for your entire life, if you're surrounded by people of your social group, and pretty much everybody knows each other for their entire life, so they have a lot of shared background, and there's no need to be spelling out every single thing. Now, if you look at the world map, you'll see that the majority of the world population lives in collectivist societies. It's only Europe and the countries that had a very strong British influence that are individualist. The US actually is the most individualist country in the world. Now, why is that some countries develop as individualist and others don't? That's a really interesting question. You see, way back in the day, collectivist mindset was the only mindset that was making survival possible. People lived in tribes, hunted together, gathered together, and being separated from your tribe meant imminent death. And then when the agriculture was developing, farming was also a collective endeavor. And so you could not do all the work on the fields by yourself. So there was a very strong dependence on your community. Individualism and its values like individual freedom, private property, is actually a relatively new idea that did not come into being until around the 17th, 18th century. What was happening at that time? Well, the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Manual labor was slowly replaced by machines, and people were moving from villages to cities and towns to work in the factories. So the communities were no longer needed as much to survive, because you'd go to work, you'd work your very, very long hours, but then you'd get paid and you could use the money to buy your food instead of having your entire family to grow it. So you could pretty much survive more or less on your own. Protestantism was another important factor that shaped individualism in people. Unlike Catholicism that saw life as suffering and pretty much if you're being good, meaning if you're being a good servant to God and to your king or whoever was the head of the state, you'll end up in heaven. But Protestantism embraced things like pursuit of individual happiness, prosperity, hard work. So it was more in line with what we call individualist values. And finally, all of that combined was also related to the Enlightenment philosophy. The philosophers were debating on how the society should be set up and how the government should be set up and what should be our guiding principles. One camp believed that society will be prosperous if everyone work hard and selflessly to benefit the society. The other camp had a reverse logic. They were saying that people are selfish, and if we let them be selfish and let them work hard to benefit themselves, then at the end of the day, the society in general will also benefit. Both points of view kind of make sense. And in today's world, if we look at countries, we'll see that we've been taking the best from both worlds, but in different amounts, depending on whether a country is more individualist or collectivist. On one hand, we have a capitalist economy, a free market where sellers compete with one another and we as buyers get better quality for cheaper. On the other hand, things like public education, free universal health care, in some countries obviously, and some other social benefits are clearly based on collectivist values and ideas. We all pay some money, taxes, in order to have access to these things. Some states or some countries tax higher, have higher taxes, and provide more social benefits. Others, like the United States, they tax a little bit less, but also provide less public goods. So our collectivist and individualist values shape our mindset as well as the approaches to our economy and politics. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I want you to understand that our values don't exist in a vacuum. They're being shaped by our social and economic realities, but also they shape those realities as well. Now, why does this dimension matter to us as PR practitioners? Well, understanding this dimension gives us a huge advantage in our professional relationships, and I will be talking more about it in more detail when we get to the topic of internal communications. Depending on where the country is located on the IDV or individualist scale, the way we target our audience and the way we construct our messages will also differ. For example, it is very rare in collectivist cultures in an ad or a commercial to show just a single individual. They're almost always surrounded by other people. The logic is, if no one wants to join this person, then the product must be bad. Another example, I remember reading a study where scholars were comparing message strategies to convince women to go do their breast cancer screening. So it turned out that the messages that appealed to a woman's personal happiness and her well-being, her personal well-being, worked way better in America than they did in China. At the same time, Chinese women responded better to the messages that emphasized that her health was important to the happiness and well-being of her family. So that's how the differences in individualism and collectivism may play out in our work. The next dimension identified by Hofstede is power distance. We've already talked about the hierarchical versus egalitarian dimension identified by Erin Meyer, and a power distance expresses pretty much the same idea. Societies differ in the degree to which they expect and accept unequal distribution of power. There was one interesting thing that I pointed out when discussing Erin Meyer's dimension, and that was an example of a Chinese employee talking about his feelings when he saw his boss riding a bike to work. It was the subordinate, this employee, who judged the boss for doing that, not the other managers who were at the same level as the boss. And Hofstede also emphasizes that this power distance dimension is described based on the value system of the less powerful members of society. In other words, if those at the lower level believe that the more powerful or those of higher status should be or should not be getting preferential treatment or receive more respect and have clearer boundaries separating them from people of the lower status. So if they believe it's fine and that's how it should be, then we would say that society has a high power distance. If people in a society don't think this should be the case, then we would say they are a low power distance society or more egalitarian society. Also, when I say more powerful, I don't necessarily mean power as political power or as wealth. In many societies, people can be assigned a higher status simply based on things like their age, so older people should be getting more respect, or their gender. For example, in Saudi Arabia, men have a higher status than women by definition, because a woman is a shadow of a man. Or another example would be a teacher-student relationship. Here's a funny video that demonstrates the difference of respect given to a teacher in the United States, which is a lower power distance society, compared to Russia, which is a higher power distance society.
Being late to class, America versus Russia.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so happy you could make it. I am so sorry I'm late. Can I please come into the classroom? I lost my book and I was helping this old lady cross the accident, and there was a fire that happened, and I had to go help out this like baby.
That's how you do it, shit, like.
When I was in school and in college in Russia, a professor or a teacher to us was something like a god. We would always stand up when a teacher comes into the classroom. This was a kind of a formal greeting, and we'd wait till the teacher gives us a permission to have a seat. It was not acceptable to challenge or argue with a teacher, or to appear in the class late or not in a proper attire. I could not imagine anyone eating during the lesson or even show up with a drink. Nor I could imagine teachers and students using the same restrooms. All of these things would demonstrate a lack of respect for a teacher. Now imagine my culture shock when I went to school here, and on my first day I saw students come into class in flip-flops and sweatpants. I don't know how common it is outside of Florida, but things like that would not be considered a big deal in low power distance societies. Because they are less of a matter of respect, but more of a matter of personal convenience and comfort for students. And also, teachers and students seem to be a lot more equal here. Teacher is definitely not a god, it's just a slightly more knowledgeable person. So when we compare low and high power distance societies side by side, we'll usually see that in high power distance societies, obedience is one of the main things that are required from children, whereas in low power distance societies, children are treated more or less equally. In high power distance societies, people are expected to display or show respect for those of higher status, whereas in low power distance societies, you won't get a different treatment if you're of a higher status. I remember my boss back in Russia said one thing that I still think about. He bought a new and a very expensive car. It was a huge car. I think it was an SUV or something like that. And he never struck me as a particularly flashy person or anything like that. So I asked him, like, you ride this car alone, not like you have 3 kids in the back. Why would you need such a big car? And he said, well, people treat you with more respect on the road. So what he meant is people are less likely to mess with you when you drive, and they would give you the way if you drive a bigger and a more expensive car than theirs. And as a result, those more hierarchical or high power societies usually have political systems where power and influence are concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people, so they're more likely to be authoritarian. Now let's look at the map. Again, we see that Western Europe, as well as countries founded by immigrants from Western Europe, such as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they all fall in the lower power distance, more egalitarian side of the scale, whereas the rest of the world is actually more hierarchical. Now, we've talked about the historical influences on the perception of power. We discussed Ehrenmeyer's dimensions. It's important to understand that most of the world's religions that are monotheists, so one-god religions, and also feudal or class systems that existed in the society, as well as the long history of authoritarian monarchies or absolute monarchies that were not restricted by any kind of parliament or constitutions, all of these things would drive societies towards higher power distance. At the same time, there are only a few exceptions that helped shape a more egalitarian view of power. And these things were, as we've talked about, the Vikings, the influence of Vikings. I mentioned that the Vikings established one of the earliest democracies in the world. Another thing was Protestantism. Again, it was a branch of Christianity, but it was way more down to earth and less about obedience and more about individual happiness and freedom, compared, for example, to Catholic Church or Orthodoxy. And the last thing was the early restriction on the absolute monarchies. So countries that relatively early adopted a constitution, established a parliament or some kind of other institution that would restrict the power given to a monarch, they tend to be a little bit more egalitarian as well. So these are very few things: Viking influence, Protestantism, and early restriction of the absolute monarchy. And very few countries actually experience them, and that's why there's so few egalitarian societies in the world. Now, what are some practical implications of power distance for us as PR practitioners? Well, definitely it affects the dynamic within the organization. Remember how the Germans had an issue with their American boss having a lunch with an employee without asking that employee's direct supervisor. So formalities like this, and also seating arrangements, who can interact with whom within the organization, all will be affected by power distance. Another thing is decision-making process. Again, we've talked about it when we discussed Aaron Meyer's deciding dimension. In hierarchical societies, the responsibility for decisions lies on the boss. The boss doesn't have to consult anybody else. He or she is not expected to. Whereas in egalitarian societies, lower level employees will expect to be included in decision-making process. High power distance actually has an advantage when it comes to the speed of the decision-making process, so when the speed is of the essence. But it has a disadvantage as well when it comes to the quality of those decisions. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, the Story of Success, writes about a very, very poor safety record of Korean airlines. And he specifically says that this is a result of hierarchical society in Korea. In his book, he makes a point that oftentimes in Korea, a co-pilot would not dare to challenge the pilot's decisions, even when co-pilot knows that the captain is wrong. And that, unfortunately, would often lead to disasters. Power distance also affects people's motivation to make purchases, specifically when it comes to luxury products. In high power distance societies, these items, luxury items, are often purchased for the sake of demonstrating status. Like my boss buying a luxury car to feel more respected on the road. But in egalitarian societies, you would need to come up with some kind of other motivations for charging the premium, such as maybe quality, safety, sustainability, and things like that. Finally, this dimension would also affect our selection for our primary and secondary audiences. For example, in societies where power distance PDI is high, mothers advise daughters. In egalitarian societies or low power distance societies, it is the daughters who advise mothers. The next dimension that we're going to be discussing is masculinity versus femininity. Oftentimes, I see people interpreting it as a degree of gender equality in society, but that's not what the dimension is about. In fact, most countries score somewhere in the middle at around 50. If the dimension did have to do with gender equality, we'd probably see a lot more of it in the world. In fact, there are feminine cultures where there's still a huge gender gap and gender inequality, and there are masculine cultures where this gender gap is closing. For example, Saudi Arabia, where women were just allowed to drive like a few years ago, is actually less masculine than the United States. Okay, I hope we cleared that out. Masculinity and femininity dimension does not compare cultures on the degree of emancipation and equal rights for men and women. But what does it compare them on? So there are traits that are traditionally considered masculine, such as strength, courage, leadership, assertiveness, initiative, competitiveness, winning. If you watch boys play, for example, their games usually have clear winners and clear losers, and it's always about competition. But also there are traits that are traditionally described as feminine, such as nurturance, care, cooperativeness, relationships. And again, when you see girls play, their games are usually based on relationships or around relationships, such as mother and daughter, a nurse and a patient, a cashier and a buyer. So there's no winners and losers in those games. It is those traits that are traditionally considered either masculine or feminine that Hofstede looked at in his research. If a society generally favored these masculine values or traits, it would score higher on the masculinity dimension. If the society leans towards more feminine values, it would score lower on his dimension. Another interesting twist to this dimension is that in feminine societies, both men and women share the values described as feminine nurturance, quality of life, relationships. So there's no expectations that what is good for a man should be different from what is good for a woman. In masculine societies, however, there is a very clear division. People tend to value masculine traits in men and feminine traits in women. There's an expectation that a man should be strong, assertive, competitive, boys don't cry, and all that kind of stuff. And there is an expectation that a woman must be caring, emotional, and very soft. And whenever we see a woman displaying man-like qualities in a masculine society, like assertiveness, right, or competitiveness, people will judge that woman and they will say that she's not feminine. And whenever there's a man that displays female-like qualities such as caring, nurtureness, people would say that he's a beta. Now you probably are seeing why the United States is on the more masculine side. Now, how else do differences in masculinity and femininity manifest themselves in various aspects of life? In terms of social norms, masculine societies are more ego-oriented, are more material than feminine societies. Feminine societies are more relationship and quality of life oriented. Masculine societies are often described as they live in order to work, whereas feminine societies are described as they work in order to live. In politics, masculine societies are obsessed with economic growth, whereas feminine societies tend to be more concerned with the protection of the environment. For religion, countries that are feminine or low in masculinity, there's usually a hodgepodge of different religions where none of them clearly dominating. And we'll get back to it when we'll be discussing the map. We also observe a smaller wage gap in feminine societies and more women in power. As you can see, social gender equality in terms of pay or position can be one of the consequences for lower masculinity score, but not necessarily. This is not what the dimension is about. Now let's look at the map. As you can see, most countries in the world are greenish and yellowish. So they're somewhere in between. And there's a bunch of countries colored in orange, that is the United States, Mexico, Venezuela, UK, Italy, Germany, China. And there are only two high masculine societies, Japan and Slovakia, this little red area in Europe. Now, Japan, with its samurai culture and crazy work ethic, is more or less understandable why it is highly masculine. But what the heck is Slovakia doing here with a score of 110 on the masculinity score? And why does the Czech Republic scores only 57? These were literally one country up until 1993. That's a really interesting question. Scholars actually have looked into it. One explanation is a measurement error. The original IBM research did not include Slovakia. Slovakia was measured on this scale significantly later and not by the Hofstede team. So recently, researchers replicated his study in Slovakia again, and they reported a score of 83. So that's a lot lower, but still there's over 20-point difference with the Czech Republic. It's still a lot. And so another explanation for this difference is the impact of religion. The Catholic Church was pretty strict on what was appropriate for men and what was appropriate for women. And countries with a very strong Catholic influence, such as Italy, Poland, Hungary, and Austria, they're over 70% Catholic, they tend to score higher on masculinity. As an aside, Protestant ethics, with its emphasis on hard work, also favors masculine values. So both Catholicism and Protestantism would contribute to higher masculinity. Anyways, back to Czechia and Slovakia. So Slovakia is 70% Catholic, but Czech Republic is actually a less religious country overall. For example, in 2021, about 50% of the Czech population reported that they did not believe in any religion, and the share of Catholics was only 9%. So pretty much the explanation for the difference between Czechia and Slovakia comes down to the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, as you can see, Scandinavian countries score the lowest on masculinity, meaning their feminine cultures. And not surprisingly that it is the Scandinavians who value the quality of life so much. Some of you probably have heard the term hygge. If you don't know what that means, I'll link an article in the lecture material. So the word actually came from Scandinavian countries and emphasized coziness, comfort, feeling of contentment with what you have, and a very, very slow, relaxed life. That's pretty much the essence of high quality of life. As far as some other historical influences are concerned, I've already mentioned a few, but you need to understand that each region might have its own historical events or influences that shaped the same value. For example, I already mentioned that both Catholic Church and Protestantism contributed to higher masculinity. Catholic Church, together with the influence of the Roman Empire, shaped the perception that men and women should have different roles, and that the society should have different expectations on people depending on their gender. And this is what made the Central and Southern Europe more masculine. At the same time, Protestantism, that emphasized hard work, shaped competitive and entrepreneurial cultures in England, Germany, and the United States. China's masculinity was shaped by Confucianism, which we already know prescribed very strict roles for different social groups, including men and women. Japan's extreme masculinity score was likely further shaped by their samurai culture, which was also influenced by Confucius, but it had a lot more strict protocols in terms of lifestyle. Finally, Vikings. Again, Vikings had a profound impact on the Scandinavian culture in terms of making it a lot more feminine. Scandinavian women actually had a lot more rights than women elsewhere. So again, there was less separation between what's considered feminine and masculine. Viking women could be entrepreneurs, they could choose who to marry, and they had no problem, for example, initiating a divorce, which was unheard of in Catholic Europe. And all members of the household would help around the house, regardless of their sex and regardless of their age. So more overlap between gender roles means lower masculinity. Now, what are some practical implications of this dimension? First off, this dimension explains differences in the need for success as a component of status, and therefore appeal of status products will vary across countries. In Scandinavian countries, you will see fewer, for example, luxury cars, even though the population is richer in general than, for example, compared to the rest of Europe. Again, anything screaming success will be a lot easier to sell in high masculinity countries. This dimension also explains the roles of males and females in buying and in family decision making. For example, in masculine cultures, it is women who do most of the grocery shopping. So if we're selling those kind of products, we will be targeting female audience. Femininity and high femininity countries or low masculinity countries, both genders do grocery shopping, and so we would need to target both genders for those types of products. Another dimension that Hofstede described is uncertainty avoidance, as opposed to uncertainty acceptance. In some research, it is also called trust versus distrust, but I actually think that the term uncertainty avoidance is a better and a more straightforward one. It describes pretty much how people in a society feel about the unknown. Hofstede specifically defines it as the extent to which members of a culture feel threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations. So in uncertainty avoidant societies, what is different, what is ambiguous, or what is unknown is perceived as dangerous. In uncertainty accepting societies, what is different, what is ambiguous or unknown is perceived as curious. In uncertainty avoidant societies, people are less open to new products and innovation, and the adoption of these kinds of products tend to be very, very slow. One example that I read about is the acceptance of genetically modified food. They mostly were looking at US, Canada, and Europe, and some of you might know the European Union has pretty strict regulations when it comes to food, and a lot of the stuff that we have here approved by the FDA is not allowed in Europe. But the GMO is not one of those products, and the producers of genetically modified products actually have had a very hard time selling these products in those European countries where uncertainty avoidance is higher, even though these GMO products were certified and were considered perfectly safe. People in high uncertainty avoidance societies more often experience anxiety, which they tend to ease by adopting very strict rules, very strict regulations. So there are a lot more of those kinds of regulations in uncertainty avoidance societies. They also tend to be more xenophobic, more racist, and less open to immigrants because, these are the unknowns. Everything new and unknown is threatening. They tend to see the world as Thomas Hobbes saw it or described it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Hobbesian worldview, but Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher who came up with the idea of social contract, which has less to do with our today's conversation, but pretty much he saw the world as a very dark, very dangerous place with humans in this world being cruel, being malevolent, greedy, and they were fighting each other for survival. And if it wasn't for the state, the government, we would end up in the war of all against all. So in order to protect themselves for that, they decided to set up the state with the government or some kind of authority. So the role of the government is to protect us from us. As we know, people in high uncertainty avoidance societies tend to believe that the rules or regulations are also there for security. Now, there was another philosopher who you may have heard about. His name was John Locke. He agreed with Thomas Hobbes on the idea of the social contract, meaning that he agreed that the power of kings, the emperors, and the rulers were not from God, but from people coming together and deciding that we need someone to be looking after us. But he disagreed with Hobbes about the human nature. He believed that humans were actually good and doing the right thing would be their preference if they are given a choice. So the cause of conflicts, according to John Locke, was not the dark human nature, but more of misunderstanding. People understood what is the right thing very differently, and especially when it comes to property right. The state, the government, the rules and the regulations were therefore needed not for security reasons as much, but for resolving the arguments around the property rights. And it seems like societies with lower uncertainty avoidance see the world more like Locke did, not like Hobbes. They see it as a nicer and safer place where humans are not enemies to each other. Now, what kind of historical events or influences may shape a society one way or the other? If we look at it from a human psychology perspective, what are the things that may make a person anxious and fearful? Obviously, that is some kind of history of traumatic events in that person's childhood. And it works the same way with nations. Traumatic events such as natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis that took thousands of lives and destroyed everything that was built, things like bloody revolutions, constant interventions and occupations from the outside the world, all of these events could be a trauma for the entire society. In fact, if you look up the worst natural disasters, you'll find that all of these regions have higher uncertainty avoidance than those neighboring regions that were not impacted. Portugal, for example, has a very high uncertainty avoidance score of 104. And if you've ever been to Portugal, you've most likely heard of the Great Lisbon earthquake. It happened in 1755. This event literally divided the life of the country into a before and an after. Before the disaster, before the earthquake, Portugal was the greatest European empire of the time. They were very wealthy, had many colonies, lots of gold. They had the best fleet. on the continent that led the way discovering the New World at the time. The earthquake destroyed a huge part of the country, including Lisbon, and took the life of 50,000 people. And the country never economically recovered from it. It lost its might and importance and just became yet another country in Europe. So that's an example of an event that could drastically influence the perceptions of uncertainty in the society. Russia also scores high on uncertainty avoidance, but not as much because of natural disasters, but more because of a 300-year occupation by the Mongols, a history of constant wars and revolutions, and also because of the impact of the Orthodox Church with its fundamentalism, conservatism, and inability to adapt. Islam and Catholicism also have a similar impact, as these religions are also pretty dogmatic, and they have been very slow to adapt to the changing world. I will remind you, my friends, that it was the Catholic Church that burned scientists alive if they dared to challenge anything that was written in the Bible. Now, Protestant Church was developed in an opposition to Catholic Church, specifically to its dogmatism. Protestants also had questions about some practices like selling indulgences or pretty much forgiven sins for money that the Catholic Church used to do. But that's a whole different story. But basically, Protestantism developed as a religion that was a lot more permissive, open to new ideas, favoring innovation and entrepreneurial spirit compared to the Catholic Church. And hence, it shaped these values in people who lived in the regions that are predominantly Protestant. Also, when I say Protestantism, there are several branches, such as Calvinism, Lutheran, and Anglican churches, but I use the word Protestantism to refer to all of them. Now, if you look at most Asian countries like China, India, Thailand, Malaysia, you'll see that most of them are actually accepting uncertainty. Most Asian religions, such as Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, actually teach that nothing in the world is certain and nothing in the world is permanent, and hence everything is subject to change. I think that's what actually shaped their views on uncertainty. So if you look at Catholic and Orthodox Christianity or Islam, the way they treat the new and unknown, they kind of say, beware of the uncertain. All the new things are dangerous. The Protestant idea can be pretty much formulated as embrace the uncertain, act on it, take the opportunity out of it. But Asian religions kind of say, acknowledge the uncertainty, but don't let it affect you. And this may actually sound very familiar to those of you who meditate, and for a reason. These meditation practices actually came from these religions. All right, but how is uncertainty avoidance related to public relations and marketing? So in the workplace, there's a preference for highly detailed instructions if you are in an uncertainty avoidance societies. Things like clean, pure, or unaltered products, or products that are marketed as such as clean and pure, will sell better in uncertainty avoidance societies. Whereas in uncertainty accepting societies, things like convenience, easiness would matter more. For example, prepared and frozen meals will sell better in those societies. In advertising, expert recommendations like white coat, a doctor, a researcher will work better in high uncertainty avoidance societies, whereas those societies that score low on uncertainty avoidance, they tend to use humor. Now, the next dimension is long-term orientation as opposed to short-term orientation. On the surface, the label for this dimension is pretty self-explanatory. A long-term orientation stands for fostering of virtues oriented towards future rewards, in particular perseverance and thrift. And you think that on the opposite side, short-term orientation, you'd find a fostering of virtues oriented to quick results and spending. And that's true, but that's only a part of the story. Here's how Hofstede defines short-term orientation. It stands for the fostering of virtues related to the present, so far so good, and the past, in particular, respect for tradition, preservation of faith, and fulfilling social obligation. And then he goes on to say that a long-term orientation is based on Confucian values and characterizes Asian societies. All right, when we look at the map, we'll see that yes, China, Japan, and South Korea score highest on this dimension. And then immediately a few questions. First of all, if Asian societies score high on long-term orientation, does that mean that they don't respect tradition and value fulfilling social obligations? Second, we know from Aaron Meyer how important the concept of preserving face was for Asian countries. Why does Hofstede put saving face as the value for short-term oriented societies? And thirdly, why is Russia and some other Eastern European countries are considered long-term oriented, even though they had nothing to do with Confucius? So I've been thinking about it a lot, and I couldn't really find literature addressing these contradictions. So we don't know for sure, but I can share some thoughts of mine. With regards to the concept of the face, this is really interesting. Hofstede, I remind you, a Western scholar, he does not explain what he means by the preservation of the face. However, Hian Qinghu, a Chinese anthropologist, says that the idea of saving face is actually pretty common in many cultures, but in Chinese language, the concept of face can be described by two distinct Chinese words, and they are forgive my Chinese, Lian and Mianzu. So she writes that Lian represents the confidence of society in the integrity of one's moral character, the loss of which makes it impossible for him to function properly in the community. On the other hand, Mianzu stands for the kind of prestige that is emphasized in this country, in America, a reputation achieved through getting on in life, through success and ostentation. So I guess the idea of saving face used by Hofstede is related to ego or pride, whereas the Asian idea of face is related to avoiding shame associated with letting down your community. And Hofstede actually does write about humbleness associated with long-term orientation and pride for oneself or for his country associated with short-term orientation. Now, the idea of tradition, which we usually oppose to the idea of innovation, in Hofstede's book, actually tradition tends to be contrasted to relativism, not to the innovation. Particularly, this becomes clear from the survey items, the questions that he asked the respondents. So he was asking them to choose between two statements. The first one, there's absolutely clear guidelines about what is good and evil. These always apply to everyone, whatever the circumstances. And the second question was, there can never be absolutely clear guidelines about what is good and evil. What is good and evil depends entirely upon the circumstances at that time. So according to Hofstede, in long-term oriented societies, virtue is not based on the absolute standards for good and evil. What is virtuous depends on the circumstances. Hence, the decisions in these societies are based on what works today, but not on an interpretation of what was written in the old holy books. This actually does sound a lot more like Russia to me, because we rewrite our constitution, the fundamental law, the fundamental document of the country, as often as it suits us. And the words, everything is not that simple, which pretty much conveys the idea of relativity of truth, the good and the evil, could be actually our national slogan. But still, I was thinking about thrift and savings. Russians don't strike me as a particularly thrifty people, but then I found these data that shows household savings as a percentage of their disposable income. Isn't that interesting? Chinese save over 30% of their income, but Russia also doesn't look too bad. I'd expect their saving rates to be much lower just because of how unstable the Russian currency and the economy in general is. I'm 33 years old and I've seen 3 economy crashes that pretty much wiped off all the people's savings. But now it looks like many people are still saving, and I was very surprised by that. So these are my thoughts on some contradictions that I found in Hofstede's description of the long-term orientation dimension. And here's some side-by-side comparison of long-term versus short-term oriented culture. On the long-term side of the scale, we'd find emphasis on persistence as opposed to the emphasis on quick result for short-term oriented cultures. Thrift versus spending, as we already talked about. In long-term societies, truth is relative, and in short-term societies, truth is absolute. Long-term societies value humbleness, whereas short-term oriented societies are characterized by pride. Decisions or judgments in short-term oriented societies are based on the prescribed norms and traditions. That's, I think, why he mentioned traditionalism. Whereas in long-term oriented societies, judgments and decisions are based on circumstances. Now, what are the implications of this dimension for us as public relations practitioners? Of course, thrift versus spending will have a huge impact on our consumption style. Durability, reliability of the product will be more important in long-term oriented societies, whereas pride in buying local, like pride in buying American, will be more important in short-term oriented societies. Another thing that you might see in the workplace, if you, for example, are interviewing a candidate from a long-term oriented culture, is that they will be very uncomfortable talking about their achievements. It doesn't mean that they don't have them, but it is considered not very appropriate to praise oneself, to be boasting about your achievements. And when I moved here, for example, the advice to advertise myself during a job interview didn't really make sense to me. In Russia, many local employers, I mean, by local, I mean non-Western, would actually more appreciate humbleness. And they would normally not ask questions related to your achievement. They would ask about your work history and your relationships with colleagues rather than what you have achieved in your workplace. Finally, the last dimension identified by Hofstede is indulgence versus restraint, and that's my favorite one. The first couple of trips that I've ever taken in my life, that was long before I moved to the United States, were actually to Latin American countries. And I immediately fell in love with the people. And to these days, I have friends all over Latin America. Russians and Latin Americans are actually very similar in many ways. If we look at the economic development, the political situations, and we'll find many similarities. And also, both of the cultures are collectivist and high power distance societies. So, lots of things in common. But there was one incredible difference that always puzzled me. Latin Americans always seem incredibly happy. I've never seen anyone having so much fun and partying so hard. Even though there is a song party like a Russian, that kind of partying is about showing off, is about showing your status, spending a lot of money. But Latin American parties were precisely about fun. And I was always wondering, how is this possible that people in these countries are so poor economically, but they always manage to stay so happy and so optimistic? I could see, for example, why Sweden, Denmark, and other Scandinavian countries would always top the list of the happiest nations. But Latin America is not Scandinavia. And it was when I read about this dimension, indulgence versus restraint, when I started to realize what the secret was. Indulgence versus restraint is the only dimension on which Russia and Latin American cultures differ. And it makes a huge difference in the way people see life and approach life. This dimension pretty much assigns a happiness score to each country. It measures subjective happiness. They were literally asking people how happy they thought they were. It also measures the perceived control of life, that is, the extent to which people believe that they had control over their own life. And the last item that was loading on this dimension is the question about the leisure time, how important it was for people to have time for fun. When I read this, it actually started to make sense why Russians were so grumpy and so pessimistic compared to Latin Americans. I grew up in a society where when they ask you, how are you, saying great and not complaining about anything is almost inappropriate. You could answer great to an enemy of yours or someone you despise just to piss them off. If you're being honest and sincere to someone you talk to, there's always something that you could complain about. Leisure time, the American saying work hard, play hard was also very odd to me because I was taught only the work hard thing. Hofstede defined this dimension as follows. Indulgence stands for a tendency to allow relatively free gratification of basic and natural human desires related to enjoying life and having fun. Its opposite pole, restraint, reflects a conviction that such gratification of needs to be curbed and regulated by strict social norms. And then he adds that the gratification of desires on the indulgent side refers to specifically enjoying life and having fun, not to gratification of desires in general. Now, what are some specific traits that we can find in indulgent and in restrained societies? So on the indulgent side, we will see a higher percentage of happy people, a perception of personal life control, and a higher importance of leisure. These are specifically the questions that they were asking. But also we'll find less moral discipline on the indulgent side. Smiling there would be a norm as opposed to restrained societies where smiling is suspect. And also freedom of speech will be more important in indulgent societies than it is in restrained, where freedom of speech is not as much of a concern. Now let's look at the map. As you can see, I happen to grow up in one of the most restrained societies in the world. So stereotypes about grumpy and tough Russians definitely apply. On the other pole, we see Scandinavia, Austria, the Americans, and some of the African countries. One interesting thing that Scandinavian indulgence is different in its content than Latin American indulgence. Scandinavian countries embrace content, quiet happiness, slow life, whereas Latin American indulgence is more festive, it's more celebratory kind of happiness. But why do some societies develop into indulgent and why other societies develop as restrained? Of course, religion has to do with it. Most of the traditional religions, such as Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Orthodox Christianity, they see life as suffering, and the real bliss is only possible after we die, right? Protestantism allows for more freedom and it embraces the idea of individual happiness. So countries that had higher influence of Protestantism tend to be more indulgent. But I think what had even greater impact is how difficult it was for people living in a given region to find or grow food. So the difficulty of agricultural work. Societies that have a very long, like 1,000-year-old history of intensive agricultural work would be higher on restraint. Imagine growing food in Russia, for example. Very long cold winters, very short time when you can actually grow something, 3 to 4 months, and that's going to be your food for the rest of the year. Crop failure, frequent drought, hunger. So you could work really, really hard and then harvest nothing. Or imagine, for example, growing rice in China or in Asia in general. This is insanely intense labor. And especially given the fact that you need to be growing rice in those flooded fields. And the flooding required a lot of work related to irrigation. At the same time, there were locations, for example, like sub-Saharan Africa, where intensive agriculture was never practiced. In Latin America, for example, growing food was a lot easier because of a milder climate, so there were more sunny days, there were enough rain. And also in Latin America, a lot of their food would come from trees, coconuts, bananas, things like that. So they didn't have to practice that intense agriculture to grow crops, for example. So some societies were just not burdened as much by intense agriculture, and that's why they had a lot more time to have fun. So what does this dimension have to do with public relations? First of all, in indulgent societies, we will see a lot more impulsive buying. Also fun as a motivation for purchases in indulgent societies is more common, whereas restrained societies would consider the usefulness rather than fun. Also, non-essential products easier to sell in indulgent countries, so things like we don't really need but we want them and we will buy them. So that kind of an attitude is more common in indulgent societies. Consumption of junk food also is higher in indulgent societies, and therefore obesity. Indulgent societies are actually really cool to be working in, because the atmosphere in the workplace is usually very casual, very relaxed, very light-spirited. So these were the 6 dimensions by Geer Hofstede. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you'll find this lesson useful, whether in your work or in your future travels.